your presentation and for staying inside of the 20 minutes that we've allocated. We now move to the other paper on this panel. The other paper on this panel by Utana Sari, of Research and Library Division of the Parliament of Malaysia, and his paper is entitled Measures to Mitigate COVID-19 in Dewan Rakyat, Implications for Parliamentary Privilege. Utana.
Very good morning to everyone. Thank you to Professor Hamid and my fellow presenter, Dr. Fadil. I'm Sana from the Research Division of Parliament of Malaysia. Greetings to all of you for attending this panel session. My paper will entitle Measures to Mitigate COVID-19 in the Dewan Rakyat, House of Representatives of Malaysia, Implications to Parliamentary Privileges. So I will structure my presentation into four main sections. Introduction, looking into the research objectives. Secondly, the comparative study, looking into the practice and procedures in other legislatures. And thirdly, the analysis, looking particularly into the right to attend and the members sitting in the chamber and their implication to parliamentary privileges, and finally we'll do some concluding remarks. The devastation caused by the pandemic COVID-19 since it emerged in late 2019 has impacted how every institution discharges its functions. That includes the legislatures. The scale of the damages is unprecedented, to the extent that public health measure has always overridden the legislature's principal duty in checking the government into account. Therefore, in times of emergency, the balance between adequate sorry, I'm not sure why the presentation. Sorry for the interruption. So in terms of emergency, the balance between adequate check and balance by the legislative and the executive successfulness in managing the crisis must be struck. So parliamentary privileges marks the separation of powers, and the feature is demonstrated in the power of Parliament to regulate its procedure, which is non-justiciable by any courts of law. So the paper objectives is firstly to analyze the impact of the rules and procedures changes towards the parliamentary privileges, and secondly to assess the extent to which the SOP, the standard operating procedures implemented during the COVID-19 pandemic should be permitted, and subsequently to also assess the justification for such measures to be taken against parliamentary privileges. So now I will just briefly describe some of the changes of rules and procedures being implemented by the House of Representatives, mostly on the changes of time, where we had time shortened for the parliamentary sitting from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Initially will end at 5:30 p.m. Secondly, on the questions time session, it has been shortened from 90 minutes to 60 minutes, and only one supplementary question being allowed by the speaker. And thirdly, the minister's question time, which we have every Tuesdays and Thursdays for 30 minutes, being truncated to only 5 minutes, with the answer will be given in written and uploaded to the parliamentary portal on the same day. The fourth one is the voting procedure, because of the SOPs on the physical distancing and avoiding the large gathering in the chamber. 2 minutes bell ring will be given and followed by 10 minutes break, and after that there will be another 2 minutes bell ring before all the members are allowed to enter the chamber to vote. And finally, I think, which is the most contentious changes of rules and procedures, is the limitation of 80 MPs to enter the chamber at one time. Consists of 41 members from the government bench and another 39 from opposition and independent bench. Special pass will be given to the member to enter the main chamber. So all these changes of rules and procedures has been implemented through the either suspension of the standing order or the power of the speaker. Next, I will just briefly describe some of the comparative study which related to the research objective that I will be elaborating more afterwards. Firstly, the House of Commons Canada, as early as I think March 2020, they have established a special committee on the COVID-19 pandemic, COVID, to meet, which consisted of all members and chaired by the speaker, to look into matters not only on government action on COVID-19 but also in other matters. And in another standing committee on procedure, they have decided to propose the House to adopt a fully virtual and hybrid proceeding. But the challenges comes with some of the constitutional aspect and the procedural aspect of the House of Commons Canada, where one of the items which I can mention here is on the quorum of the House, as the Constitution and the standing orders state that there must be the presence of at least 20 members to constitute the meeting of the House. Therefore, the presence of member has not been explained. Therefore, it will require the amendment to the standing order to define the meaning of presence in the meeting of the House. Secondly, in the House of Representatives of Australia, also quite relatively quick in resolving to provide manner and form to meet for members of parliament. In March, they have adopted a resolution to allow remote participation in proceedings, which the House authorized the use of an official video facility, but with certain limitation. It's described in the resolution. But what interests me in the practice of House of Representatives Australia is the fairness between government and opposition in distributing the time and the agenda of the House to both sides of the party. Thirdly, within the Chamber of Deputies Brazil, also amazed me with the quite relatively quick in putting forward a solution, a technological solution to enable a virtual solution. As early as March, the Chamber approved to establish a remote deliberation system enabling virtual plenary session of the House. And on top of that, they have the InfoLeg app which has already existed to provide information on all bills, including the full text of bills and any amendments, upgraded to incorporate secure voting during virtual proceedings. So it marks the agility and creativity of the Chamber of Deputies in allowing a session, the parliamentary session, to continue during pandemic. So now I'm going to the practice of the Dewan Rakyat, which implies the right to attend to parliamentary proceedings. So the centrality of the right to attend to parliamentary proceedings is an inherent and indispensable right of Member of Parliament, looking into the case of Richard Strode in 1512, which he attempted to introduce a bill to regulate the rights of teen minors in Dartmoor, in which he was arrested and imprisoned. When he later released from his imprisonment, the Privilege of Parliament Act was passed in Parliament, which gives immunity to bills. So the centrality of the right to attend parliamentary sittings is shown in the motion moved in the House. So in every session, in the right after the opening of Parliament, a motion will be tabled by the Minister of Home Affairs to instruct the Inspector General of Police to provide free passages to members of both houses. So what entails from this motion is on the privilege of member to get free access to the House of Parliament. So that's one point. And another issue on the right to attend, as I previously described, is the limitation of 80 members to enter the chamber. So I'll touch upon the first issue on the motion to provide the free passages to Member of Parliament to enter the House, in which during the COVID measures, there were extra precautionary measures taken to limit the attendance of people, the entrance of people to the House of Parliament. And in one occasion, members of Parliament has been blocked to enter the Parliament, which I will relate to the right to attend to parliamentary proceedings, including the motion that being passed in the House. And secondly, the issue of the limitation of a Member of Parliament to attend the House, the main chamber, basically is one of the contentions against the free representational mandate of Members of Parliament. So both of these two issues has its implication towards the right to attend to parliamentary proceedings, including on how the motion passed in the House being applied to the people outside of the parliamentary proceeding, i.e. the Inspector General of Police, which has made certain limitation to the right of the Member of Parliament. The second issue on the of the paper is the member sitting implication to parliamentary privileges. So the attendance limitation to adhere with the SOPs for physical distancing has been as a result of the King's proclamation for parliamentary proceedings to be held in the parliamentary building. I must say that the pandemic comes at a point when the country has its some kind of political changes. There were political government changes during the early stages of the pandemic, so that has compounded to the issue of parliamentary operation, where Parliament has been postponed its proceedings, and in I think last year, due to the emergency proclamation, the Parliament has been suspended. So that's the context that people has to understand on why certain measures or certain implications with the parliamentary privilege and the parliamentary operation has been taken off. So the extent to which the subsequent sittings, because the King's proclamation has always stipulated that the parliamentary proceeding has to be in the House of Parliament. But the question is whether the proclamation applies only to the first sitting, which is the opening session, the opening sitting, or also applied to the subsequent sittings. Because as compared to other similar Westminster system, that is Australia, which I have seen that the Governor General's proclamation has similar nature of proclamation with the King's proclamation, which stipulated that the parliamentary session has to be held in the Parliament's building, but they able to allow a remote participation. So that's the question that raises on the I think the willingness of the Parliament to depart from its conventional and apply some creativity to allow its operation. That's the first one. And another issue on the member sitting is during the COVID measures, members has been seated across the main chamber away from their designated seats. They even been allowed to vote not in their designated seats. So that's one question on the boundary of the parliamentary privilege for members of parliament, their privilege for speaking, for voting, because of the standing orders is silence on the place for the members is allowed to vote. And based on the practice, as you can see at the back of the photo there, that is the public gallery where in one occasion members are allowed to vote in that area. So that comes to conclusion of my presentation. The SOPs and the speakers' rulings is meant to contain the spread of the virus, but definitely it has deprived certain rights and privileges of members. Secondly, as I said, the willingness of Parliament to adapt and depart from conventional, as we also all aware that Parliament has its own tradition, which has made it quite reluctant to move away from its tradition, is imperative to ensure that Parliament continue in times of crisis. Thirdly, the free representational mandate of MP is equally important as parliamentary privileges. And last but not least, the recipients of the House in regulating its procedure, not to impede any rights, privileges, mandate and functions of Parliament. I think with that quote, I end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Montana Sari, for your presentation. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have about half an hour available to us now for some questions. So the floor is open for questions to the presenters.
I've got a question for each, Mukesh and Montana, if I'm pronouncing your names correctly. Firstly, thank you both for your presentations, very interesting. My name is Andrea, I'm from Australia. So Mukesh, my question to you is that you indicated that the Parliament didn't pass any new law but relied on colonial law for its public health ordinance. And I'm just interested in your views about whether that situation curbed the ability of the Parliament, or contributed to the ability of the Parliament to be proactive and reactive because it had no heads up. And I realise that was probably coupled with the fact that the Speaker took some time to debate the motion on the notice paper.
I think what had happened in the case of Trinidad and Tobago with regard to going back to the colonial law was that any new law that was to be passed would have to come into the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago, and that would affect what they call the fundamental rights. And the issue is that whether or not the government or the executive was going to get the support of the opposition in the parliament, because it would mean that the government coming to parliament with laws would have to come to terms with the constitution, would have to get the opposition support, depending on what we call the law itself and how it affected the fundamental rights. Then the opposition input would become far much more important in the passage of the laws. So in this context, the government or the cabinet itself went back to the colonial law that was saved when we became an independent state in 1962. So they were able to use it even though the law itself would have actually conflicted with the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago, but it allowed the executive and the government extension the ability to implement the resolutions and the public health, use the public health ordinance to affect what we call the measures for the population of Trinidad and Tobago. So it was convenient in that context.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And is it right if I ask
Please
Nathaniel?
do.
Nathaniel, thank you also for your presentation. I note that the source of your parliamentary privilege is from statute, and then you indicated, and correct me if I may have misunderstood, is that the changes to the rules and procedures for the parliament are happening due to suspension of standing orders and the power of the speaker. I'm just wondering whether there was any opportunity for debate in relation to those proposed changes, or they just unilaterally happen.
Yeah.
If I'm making sense.
Yeah, basically the rules and procedures changes actually been discussed by the speaker and the representative from each major political bloc. So it comes to the agreement that the rules and procedures changes applied in the House, even though it has been is quite contentious on several matters and issues, which I rightly raised just now on the parliamentary privilege and the free representational mandate. But the issue is on how Parliament adapt and move forward to accommodate such changes, so that the issues that I have raised now could be attended well. So that's the main issue of the rules and procedures changes. Even though that it's been agreed, it is contentious, it is debatable, and it could be applied in I think a more creative or sustainable way on how Parliament can sustain its operation.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you for the speakers. Really, I would like just to know whether there is the COVID pandemic phenomena consequences. There are some rumors that has been politically abused by some governments. Was that applied to Trinidad and Malaysia?
If I may just make reference to how the abuse of the resolutions that were passed by the speaker. I just raised at one point here, when the screening, we got to the temperature. Now all members entering the parliament would have to be screened by the temperature, and in one instance, in the resolution passed by the speaker, spoke about 37.5 degrees Celsius. And it is said that all persons entering must record a temperature less than 37.5. However, if it is that there is someone recorded a temperature, let's say on some other health issue, they were referred to the Ministry of Health personnel to test. Now, even though they were tested by the Ministry of Health personnel, and the temperature dropped below 37.5, they were not allowed to enter the parliamentary complex, even though the Ministry of Health would have actually passed and said, yes, you are not exhibiting any of the symptoms, just maybe the day itself, temperature have risen, something other than COVID. So the resolution itself, yes, it was kind of rigid in the context of Trinidad, especially how they used it in this industry.
I would not say any political abuse, but more looking into the context of how the system of parliament, system of government being structured, that gives certain age to the government. Compounded to that, the COVID measures has, as I mentioned in my introduction, has given some leeway to the government to implement the public health measure. So the measures taken to mitigate the risk of COVID-19 in Parliament must be done reasonably. So the question of reasonable must be defined by the participating interested parties, so that not to impede the rights and privileges of parliamentarians, parliamentary privileges, and the functions of Parliament itself. So that goes back to the how Parliament or system of government being structured to handle or to attend to such a situation of emergency. I would say like that.
Hi, I'm Danny, and I also have two brief questions to both of you. But first of all, thank you very much for sharing your insights. And my question to Cash is this bicameral divide that you described, is it outstanding? Does it happen before that the Senate and the House want to go in a different direction, or is it just a phenomenon of this pandemic?
I think it's the two chambers, so although they were part of a single parliament, both chambers tend to see that they operate under different what we call standing orders. And one thing I did not interpret, I didn't get time to discuss it and I'll raise it here, was that while the resolution was in play with regard to the number of members can be in the chamber, that continued for the House of Representatives. But in 2021, the President of the Senate made a ruling that the chamber can accommodate all senators. So while in the other chamber there was restriction on the number of MPs that can be in the chamber at one point in time, the Senate in its proceeding decided, the President says that, okay, all senators can now come into the chamber, and I'm relaxing the rule, the tribunal rule, that we have to be back in the chamber to vote. So at one point in time, the President of the Senate, what we are seeing is that the President of the Senate implementing these resolutions for the proceedings in the chamber was different to what the Speaker would have done in the House of Representatives. So yes, I'm saying there were two chambers in a single institution, but they tend to operate as autonomous bodies with regard to the COVID pandemic.
Thank you. My question to China. China is you just described how MPs have been, or the rights of MPs have been restricted. And my question is, were there any complaints about that coming from MPs, which brought about a threatening going to the courts or to some other agencies to submit their complaints?
Yeah, I think numerous, as usual, MPs which felt they have been denied certain rights, obviously will make complaints and some kind of statements on the rights that they have, which has been denied. Yeah, but basically, in times of emergency, the question backs into the power of the government to justify its measures for measures to mitigate the COVID-19. So I think for over 2 years, despite the complaints and requests for certain rights or certain privileges for Parliament to continue its function in times of crisis, the government has always an advantage to I think to deprive certain rights of MPs because of the public health measures. That's the scenario that's been happening over the last 2 years until the restriction and the measures has been eased so that Parliament can continue its operation in its normal time. Yeah.
Yes, question
So,
and then.
I have a question for Mutana. So, first of all, why did you decide to compare with the House of Commons, with Canadian House of Commons, Australia and Brazil, and not other legislatures? And also, why didn't you include the Malaysian sub-national legislatures? So that was my question.
So I think first of all, those three nations being compared because there's some certain elements of similarity on the structure and the system of parliament, how it works. Like Canada, we are same as a federation. Australia looking into also quite similar, as I mentioned, the Governor General's proclamation on the bicameral system of the Australian Parliament, as well as looking into the specific measures taken in between the government and opposition, as well thirdly on the Brazilian Chamber of Deputies on how their creativity or their agility, their response to the emergency to come up with a solution to allow Parliament to continue its operation. While for the sub-national legislative, it's not so much different because when the country, as I mentioned earlier, in the context of political changes of government, there's some the result of that occurrences, including when the emergency orders has been put, it also implies to the sub-national legislative. So that's not so much that we can describe on the sub-national legislative as well. So that's it.
I'm Senator Anwar Kahal from Pakistan. My own observation during the stint of this public emergency, what happened post-COVID-2019, that at times Parliament and standing committees' functions were curtailed and in a way stifled, prima facie for political reasons. And in transitional democracies like yours and ours and many others, which is not part of the settled democracies, living democracies, is there any deep desire, if you have observed that the parliamentary heads, be that in that case either a speaker or a president or a chairman somewhere, that they want to emulate a role of executive, which can take more power, which want to have a check and balance to demonstrate authority, rather than going to the essence of the democracy where there has to be participation, there has to be a debate on particular issues, where opposing views, they do emerge and they are exhibited. So at large, the public could benefit. What would be your valuable insight, both of you? Is that the case, or probably we are seeing it with a different angle? Thank you so much.
If I may just bring an example in the case of Trinidad and Tobago and the application. In the Senate, an opposition senator was sent before the Committee of Privileges in the Senate. Now, in March of 2020, the proceedings were, Senate proceedings were on, let's say, online, using Zoom. However, in this particular case, the senator raised an important point, that his proceeding, his hearing was to be held in person, while all the other committees and proceedings were in camera, as we would say. And they're trying to figure out what it is. Now, he objected because he saw it as political prosecution. Because the committee was basically, the majority was government members on the Committee of Privileges, he felt that he was being prosecuted by. So Senator Arnold Roberts raised it, and he never appeared before the committee, and he brought forward his health issues. He said he was an asthmatic patient, and he cannot risk his health by appearing before a committee in person. And that was his argument. But the point of it is that it was deemed to be political prosecution where the government was using that majority to prosecute, let's say, an opposition member of parliament. So it was used in this context where the executive would tend to use the powers, because both the president of the Senate and the speaker were government members. So you have to understand, in a small parliament, the executive authority became much more enhanced during the pandemic in the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you.
In the context of Malaysian Parliament, I think the nature of the pandemic itself has given some understanding to the whole of nation on the importance of measures taken in the public healthcare by the government. Despite the restrictions and limitation on the parliamentary and parliamentarians' rights in taking the government into account, there's certain understanding that government must be given some space and room to take their action to eventually defeat the spread of the diseases.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Thank you both for the presentations. My question is for both speakers.
Yeah.
Is there any information collected on how effective the restrictions were in terms of the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago and Parliament of Malaysia? Any estimations on
The information, as you call the impact of it, regardless if I would say how many members or parliamentary staff, whatever, infected by the disease itself, that information was not forthcoming. Although there was information where a number of ministers did contract the disease, but it cannot be linked back to the parliament or the parliament precinct itself, because there were ministers, their own ministries, and they had to interact with the public. It could have been in that case. And as we speak to yesterday, Speaker Professor Gani, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, has reported that he has contracted COVID. The debate is whether it was the second time or the third time, but his paper reported the second time. So this is the issue of the impacts is an ongoing process.
For context of Parliament of Malaysia, in terms of providing information, we had actually documented all measures taken for the COVID-19 prevention through a book which we hope that will be a source of reference to others, particularly in times that any such emergency or crisis emerging. So I think that would be useful and helpful to not only the Parliament itself, as well as the subnational legislative, and perhaps to other legislation to know and get some knowledge on how the Parliament has responded to such a crisis and emergency.
Any other questions from anyone?
Thank you.
I'm not sensing a groundswell of questions. Let's go around the room one more time. Any takers? Any questions? All right, well, if we don't have any more questions, could you join me in thanking our two presenters, Dr. Balazir and that brings this session to a close, so we can retire to the buttery for light refreshment. Thank you.
Thank you.